The Pinecrest Heights HOA fined 72-year-old Navy veteran Ezra Thorne $10,000 for his wheelchair ramp, the one his doctor ordered and the city had fully permitted. Board President Vivian Blackwood stood over him in the driveway, heels clicking on the spotless concrete, and said with a sneer, "Maybe you should have thought twice before buying here, old man. This isn't a nursing home." She turned and walked away, leaving behind the sharp scent of her expensive perfume and the metallic creak of Ezra's wheelchair as he watched her go. What Vivian didn't know, what no one in the neighborhood knew, was that Ezra wasn't the broke, helpless pensioner they assumed. Over the previous 15 years, while everyone saw only a quiet, disabled veteran driving a beat-up 2008 Honda Civic and clipping grocery coupons, he had quietly become the largest property owner in Pinecrest Heights. Through Thornfield Properties LLC, he had purchased 423 homes, nearly half the entire 847-house development. His holdings were worth $47 million, and for years he had been meticulously documenting every illegal action the HOA board took. By the time the sun set that same day, the woman who had mocked a disabled war hero would learn she had been collecting rent checks from the very man she tried to ruin. And Ezra was about to show 847 households what real justice felt like. Ezra never set out to become a landlord or a shadow kingpin of the neighborhood. 3 years earlier, when his wife Martha lost her long fight with cancer, she had held his weathered hand in the hospital room that smelled of disinfectant and fading jasmine and whispered, "Promise me you'll help people who can't help themselves." He had served 30 years in Navy intelligence, his spine shattered by Gulf War shrapnel, and thought Pinecrest Heights would be the place for a quiet retirement. Then a childless uncle died and left him $2. $3 million. He could have watched corporate landlords and predatory boards devour the community, or he could do something about it. Martha always said the quietest person in the room sees the most. So Ezra did what Navy intelligence had trained him to do. He disappeared. He bought every foreclosure, every estate sale, every distressed property that came on the market. Not to get rich, but to keep rents affordable for teachers, mechanics, nurses, and retirees. He kept his life modest so no one would suspect. Pinecrest Heights charged $340 a month in HOA fees and enforced a rulebook thicker than most military manuals. Landscaping trucks rumbled through early mornings, central air units droned constantly, glossy violation notices arrived like clockwork. Vivian Blackwood, third-term president and a high-end real estate agent who treated her white BMW X5 like a personal yacht, specialized in targeting the elderly and disabled with petty citations while ignoring identical violations on board members' properties. A neighbor named Rosa Martinez, a paralegal who lived a few streets over, had noticed the pattern for months. She explained to Ezra once at the mailboxes that selective enforcement violated state housing laws. HOAs couldn't legally hammer one resident while letting others slide on the same issue. Most people didn't know their rights. Vivian counted on that. When Ezra installed the ramp, Vivian pounced. Unauthorized structural modification, she declared at the board meeting, ignoring her own fence that sat 6 inches over the setback line. The vote was 4-1 to fine him $10,000. Only Rosa dissented. Vivian's parting words echoed off the community center walls. "This isn't a nursing home." Ezra said nothing. He nodded once, wheeled out, and went home. That night, under the hum of crickets and the long shadows of streetlights, he sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by property deeds, and made a quiet phone call. "Marcus," he said, voice steady with 30 years of command, "it's time to activate Phase 1. Pull the Thornfield files, all 423 properties." He paused. Martha would want justice, not just revenge. The next morning, Rosa found him in the cereal aisle at the grocery store. She whispered that the board was breaking its own bylaws and she had been keeping records. She had no idea she was giving legal advice to the man who secretly owned the duplex where her own son lived rent-free. Over the following weeks, Vivian weaponized her small victory. Violation notices arrived daily. Mailbox 2 inches too high, $250. Trash bin visible 5 minutes after pickup, $500. Too many bird feeders, $350. Then she added a retroactive $500 architectural review fee for Ezra's ramp. Her nephew Brad, the new HOA inspector, began photographing Ezra's house every single day. Accidents followed. Landscaping crews accidentally sprayed industrial weed killer across Martha's rose bushes, the ones Ezra had tended for 30 years. The chemical stench lingered for days as the blooms blackened and died. Utility workers cut his cable during a doctor's telehealth appointment. The sprinkler system mysteriously flooded his driveway, while Vivian watched from across the street with a satisfied smile. Old infrastructure issues, she told concerned neighbors. They affect everyone eventually. Ezra recognized the pattern: sleep deprivation, financial pressure, social isolation. Textbook psychological warfare. He had studied it in the Gulf. The only difference was that Vivian wore designer athleisure instead of camouflage. But he stayed patient. While Brad photographed violations, Ezra photographed right back. Vivian's illegal fence, the treasurer's unpermitted deck, the secretary's home business signs that violated commercial restrictions. Rosa, watching for a kitchen window, first thought grief had made him obsessive. Then she saw the systematic evidence collection and realized he was building an airtight, selective enforcement case. State law carried severe penalties for boards that engaged in it. Rosa's courthouse research uncovered something bigger. The HOA's legal budget had ballooned 300% in 18 months, with huge payments to enforcement consulting firms tied to board members' families. Then her own son received a $2,000 fine for a basketball hoop that had been approved 3 years earlier. Rosa understood. Vivian was no longer targeting only Ezra. Anyone who showed him sympathy became a target. That evening, she overheard Ezra on another call. Document the retaliation. Yes, she's expanding targets. Perfect for the federal civil rights complaint. Rosa felt ice in her veins. Federal. By week 3, his fines totaled $18,500. Vivian escalated to malice. An anonymous tip sent Adult Protective Services to his door, claiming an elderly man in mental decline was living in unsafe conditions. The investigator found nothing, but the public humiliation was the point. The final notice arrived with ceremony. Vivian personally delivered the foreclosure threat, posing for photos beside his mailbox like a conquering general. Pay up or get out, old man. This community has standards. Ezra folded the letter carefully, added it to his growing file, and wheeled home humming an Old Navy tune. The story leaked to local news first, framed exactly as Vivian wanted. Disabled veteran refuses to follow community rules. Channel 7 interviewed her as the reasonable leader facing an entitled troublemaker. Some people think military service entitles them to special treatment, she said, dabbing at non-existent tears. Sabotage intensified. Tree crews dropped heavy branches on his Honda. Pest control sprayed chemicals near his air intake during a heat wave. Street cleaners soaked his porch daily. Security patrol cars idled outside his house for hours, motion sensors flooding his bedroom windows with harsh light every 30 minutes. Large men in HOA uniforms peered through his windows daily. Then Rosa uncovered the money trail through FOIA requests. Vivian's husband, City Councilman Derek Blackwood, had approved $847,000 in no-bid contracts to companies owned by his extended family. Work never performed or wildly overcharged. Ezra's response was calm. Martha always said, follow the money. I've been following it for 18 months. Marcus isn't just my property lawyer. He's preparing federal racketeering charges. Every incident, every accident, every retaliation had been documented like war crimes. The neighborhood finally cracked when 84-year-old Mrs. Morgan received a $5,000 fine for garden gnome violations. Her ceramic figures had stood peacefully for 15 years, until HOA pest treatment killed her jasmine plants, the ones that perfumed the whole block every spring. Rosa found her sobbing in the driveway, clutching the notice. I cannot pay. Social Security, not enough. They take my house now. That image broke the fear barrier. 12 households gathered secretly in Rosa's living room, sharing stories. Tom Kowalski described how HOA contractors had accidentally destroyed the memorial oak planted for his fallen son. Ezra spoke quietly. Tomorrow morning, Marcus files federal civil rights charges. Every incident becomes evidence in a racketeering case. Conspiracy to deprive constitutional rights, systematic terrorism, organized fraud. We're not fighting an HOA anymore. We're dismantling a criminal enterprise. The room went still. Rosa stared at her neighbor and realized she had been watching a decorated intelligence officer run the most sophisticated suburban sting operation in memory. The next evening, Vivian called an emergency meeting to ratify foreclosure. Channel 7 cameras rolled. She opened with a slideshow of problem properties. Ezra's house featured prominently. Community standards protect everyone's investment, she declared. Rosa stood, manila folder in hand, voice steady from paralegal training. Mrs. Blackwood, I have concerns about selective enforcement patterns and financial irregularities. City records show your husband approved $847,000 in no-bid contracts to companies owned by your family. Meanwhile, board members have identical violations that were never cited. Murmurs rose like distant thunder. Vivian, try to shut it down. These conspiracy theories have no place here. Ezra wheeled to the microphone. The room fell completely silent. 3 years ago, my dying wife asked me to help people who couldn't help themselves, he began, voice carrying 30 years of command. I kept that promise by quietly purchasing 423 properties in this neighborhood through Thornfield Properties, LLC, 49.9% of Pinecrest Heights. Vivian whispered the number like a death sentence. 49.9% while you terrorized disabled veterans and elderly widows, Ezra continued. I documented every illegal act for federal prosecutors. Not for revenge. For justice. The room erupted. Vivian tried to flee. A man in a navy suit who had sat quietly in the back all evening stepped forward, displayed federal credentials, and said, Vivian Blackwood, you're under arrest for racketeering, conspiracy, civil rights violations, and domestic terrorism. Handcuffs clicked. Cameras caught everything. Derek bolted for the emergency exit and ran straight into 2 FBI agents. Agent Sarah Morgan addressed the stunned residents. Mr. Thorne contacted federal authorities 18 months ago about systematic civil rights violations targeting vulnerable people. His evidence enabled the most comprehensive RICO case against HOA corruption in federal history. All fines were voided. Restitution would come from seized assets. Mrs. Morgan wept with relief. Tom Kowalski stood and saluted. Dawn brought black SUVs, bankers' boxes of evidence, and the discovery of the Blackwood Extraction Database, a spreadsheet ranking every household by vulnerability and profit potential. Ezra was priority target number 1. Disabled veteran, recently widowed, potentially wealthy, isolated. Systematic harassment approved for $50,000 plus extraction. What had looked like petty HOA bullying was organized crime that had studied residents' psychological weaknesses like predators selecting prey. Federal forensic accountants traced 12 shell companies, fake contracts, $1. $7 million in diverted taxpayer money. Thousands of emails, recorded calls, and psychological profiles created an ironclad case. 2 years later, Pinecrest Heights was unrecognizable in the best way. The Ezra Thorne Community Protection Act had passed Congress with bipartisan support, establishing federal oversight for HOAs nationwide and criminalizing systematic harassment tactics. The Martha Thorne Community Justice Foundation, funded by book royalties and grants, provided legal help to hundreds of communities fighting similar schemes. Ezra still rolled through the neighborhood each morning, coffee in hand, greeting neighbors who now understood they owed their piece to his 3-year sacrifice. Children played again. Gardens bloomed. Mrs. Morgan's jasmine perfumed the block once more. He never wanted to be a hero. He just kept a promise to a dying woman. Help those who can't help themselves. And in doing so, one quiet veteran reminded everyone that justice doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives in a wheelchair, patient, precise, and unstoppable.